Settle in. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we journey to a place of solitude and rhythmic repetition, where the boundary between land and sea dissolves into fog, and the only certainties are the turning of a lens and the passage of time. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of the world. The year is 1885. Behind you, civilization continues its relentless forward march. Before you, nothing but gray water meeting gray sky, and between them, the lighthouse where you will spend the next weeks in near total isolation. This is not a story of heroism or adventure. This is the story of work steady, deliberate, essential work. The kind that fills hours and days with small, repeated motions. The kind that becomes a meditation, whether you seek it or not. The life of a lighthouse keeper in the 1880s was defined not by dramatic moments, but by their absence. It was defined by routine, by the mechanical precision of tasks performed in the same order, day after day, by the sound of waves that never ceased, by weather that came and went while you remained, a fixed point in a changing seascape. Tonight, we will explore this world together, not to excite, but to soothe, to find comfort in the predictability of duty, the gentle monotony of careful work, and the strange peace that isolation can bring. Let us begin. The first task of each day begins before the sun shows itself on the horizon. You wake not to an alarm, but to an internal clock developed over months of this same routine. The tower is cold. It is always cold in the early morning, regardless of the season. Stone holds the night's chill with stubborn persistence. Your feet find the floor wooden planks worn smooth by countless crossings. The small keeper's quarters at the base of the tower smell of lamp oil, salt air, and the previous night's modest supper. There is no rushing. Everything in lighthouse keeping moves at its own measured pace. You dress in layers. Wool trousers, a cotton shirt, a heavier vest, perhaps a jacket if the wind is particularly fierce. The clothing is practical, never decorative. It bears the stains of oil and the wear of constant use. You pull on thick socks and boots, lace them with fingers still stiff from sleep. The staircase curves upward through the heart of the lighthouse, a spiral of iron or stone that seems to go on forever, though you know precisely how many steps it takes. Your hand trails along the wall, rough under your palm. The sound of your footsteps echoes in the confined space, a rhythm that matches your breathing. As you climb, you pass the clockwork mechanism S-weights hanging in their tube, a heavy cable descending through the center of the tower, attached to 275 pounds of iron that makes the whole system work. You'll need to attend to that later, winding it back to the top, a task that requires both strength and patience. The higher you climb, the more the building sways. It's imperceptible to most, but you've learned to feel it, the gentle motion of the tower responding to wind, to the vibrations of waves striking the rocks below. It's oddly comforting, this reminder that even stone and iron possess flexibility. Finally, you reach the lantern room. Glass surrounds you on all sides, offering a panoramic view of the sea. In the pre-dawn darkness, the frontal lens dominates the space, a magnificent structure of precisely cut glass prisms arranged in concentric rings, each one catching and bending the lamplight into a powerful beam visible for miles. The lens is still rotating, turned by the clockwork mechanism you wound the previous evening. The steady tick-tick of the gears is a sound you hear even in your sleep now. Bullseye panels in the lens create the flashing pattern that identifies this particular lighthouse to passing ships, perhaps one flash every 3 minutes, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. You stop the clockwork mechanism first, halting the lens's rotation with the pull of a lever. The sudden stillness feels almost wrong after the night-long motion. Then you attend to the lamp itself, a carefully trimmed wick burning in a reservoir of oil. You extinguish it with practiced care, ensuring no smoke damages the lens. With the light extinguished, the real work begins. You refill the oil reservoir from a can you carried up the stairs, tipping it with steady hands to avoid spills. Spilled oil means extra cleaning, and in this enclosed space, the smell would linger for days. Next comes the cleaning of the lens itself. This is perhaps the most meditative task of your day. You retrieve a soft linen cloth kept pristine for this purpose alone, and begin to polish each prism, each panel of glass. The Fresnel lens is a marvel of engineering, but it is also delicate. Fingerprints, salt spray, the residue of burned oil, all must be removed with gentle circular motions. The work is slow. There is no rushing it. Each section of the lens receives the same careful attention. Your cloth moves in small circles, the glass squeaking softly as it comes clean. Outside the windows, the sky begins to lighten first to deep blue, then to pale gray, then to the soft pink and orange of sunrise. But you barely notice. Your attention is on the glass, on the rhythmic motion of your hand, on ensuring that tonight's light will shine as brightly as possible. Once the lens is cleaned to satisfaction, you place a linen bag over it, protection from dust and sunlight during the day. Then you draw the curtains around the lantern room's windows, filtering the daylight that could, over time, damage the lens or prematurely age the materials. You clean and lubricate the clockwork mechanism, a task requiring patience and attention to small details. The gears must move smoothly. Any grinding or catching could mean the lens fails to rotate properly tonight, and a lighthouse that doesn't exhibit its characteristic pattern is worse than no lighthouse at all. You polish the brass fittings, not for appearance, though there is pride in your work, but because salt air corrodes metal with relentless determination. Today's polishing prevents tomorrow's breakdown. The climb down is always faster than the climb up. Your legs know each step intimately. Back in the keeper's quarters, you turn to the logbook, a thick, bound volume, where every detail of the station's operation must be recorded. The entries are formulaic, repetitive. The date, the time of lighting and extinguishing, weather conditions, wind direction and strength, visibility, sea state, any ships observed, their heading if determinable, the state of supplies, any irregularities, though there rarely are any. Your handwriting is neat, practiced. These records matter. They're inspected during periodic visits from the lighthouse service. They're consulted if questions arise about conditions on particular dates. They're proof that you're doing your job, day after day, even when no one is watching. With the morning's primary duties complete, the middle portion of the day stretches before you. These are the hours for maintenance, for the endless small tasks that keep a lighthouse functioning. Perhaps today you'll clean the tower stairs, sweeping away the dust and grit that accumulates. Perhaps you'll attend to the living quarters, washing dishes, tidying the small space that serves as bedroom, kitchen, and sitting room all at once. Perhaps you'll inspect the station's supplies, counting cans of oil, checking the condition of wicks, noting what needs to be requested on the next supply run. If the weather permits, you might venture outside to maintain the grounds such as they are. Weeds grow even on rocky outcroppings. Paint peels in the salt air. Railings need inspection for rust. The boat landing requires checking after every storm. But often, the weather does not permit outdoor work. The 1880s lighthouse keeper learns to work in conditions that would send most people. Indoors wind that makes standing difficult, rain that comes at you horizontally, fog so thick you can't see your own hand extended at arm's length. On such days, you work inside. There is always something to clean, something to repair, something to prepare. As the day progresses toward evening, your attention turns increasingly toward the approaching night. You check the weather again, noting any changes. A storm building on the horizon means tonight might be long. You need to stay in the lantern room, watching the light continuously rather than checking it at intervals. You prepare the evening's oil supply, ensuring you have enough not just for tonight, but for several nights if weather prevents you from retrieving more. You inspect the wick again, trimming it to the precise length that produces the cleanest, brightest flame. You might eat a simple meal, probably something that required little preparation. beans, bread, salt pork, tea. The keeper's diet in the 1880s was not varied or exciting. It was fuel, nothing more. As sunset approaches, you make the climb once more. Your legs are tired now. You've been up and down these stairs multiple times already today, but the climb is so familiar, it requires almost no thought. In the lantern room, you reverse the morning's process. You open the curtains, flooding the space with the fading daylight. You remove the linen cover from the lens, revealing the clean glass that will soon project light across the water. You inspect the lens one final time, checking for any smudges or imperfections you might have missed that morning. Finding none, you turn to the lamp. The oil reservoir is full. The wick is trimmed. You light it carefully, watching as the flame catches and steadies. For 30 minutes, you remain in the lantern room, watching the lamp, ensuring it burns correctly, that the oil feeds properly, that no problems develop. Then you crank the clockwork mechanism. This is hard work. Lifting 275 pounds of weight by turning a crank requires strength and endurance. Your arms ache, your back protests. But slowly, steadily, the weight rises in its tube, the cable wrapping around the barrel, storing the energy that will keep the lens rotating through the night. Finally, you release the mechanism. The weight begins to fall. The barrel begins to turn. Gears engage with metallic clicks, and the lens, that beautiful, precise arrangement of glass, begins its slow rotation. The light, projected through the bullseye panels, begins to flash. 3 minutes of steady light, then a moment of relative darkness as the metal panels pass between lamp and sea, and light again. The rhythm is hypnotic. You could watch it for hours, but you have more work to do. The nighttime routine depends on the weather. On clear, calm nights, you might descend to the keeper's quarters, returning every few hours to check the lamp and crank the clockwork. These visits break the night into segments, each climb, each cranking, each confirmation that all is well. On stormy nights, you stay in the lantern room. You watch the light continuously, ready to address any problem immediately. You crank the clockwork more frequently, maintaining the rotation despite the tower swaying, despite the wind that seems determined to extinguish the lamp, despite the spray that coats the windows and must be wiped away again and again. The sound of the storm surrounds you. Wind howls through every gap and crevice. Waves crash against the rocks with percussive force that you feel in your chest. Rain batters the glass with fury. Inside your glass-walled room at the top of the tower, you sit at the center of chaos, tending a flame. There's something almost peaceful about it. Despite the violence outside, you have a purpose. The light must shine. Ships depend on it. Lives depend on it. And you, alone in your tower, are the one ensuring that this small, steady light continues to pierce the darkness. The hours pass. The lens rotates. The clockwork ticks. Your hand cranks. The storm rages. And somehow morning comes. Let us turn our attention now to one keeper in particular. His name was William Harper, and in the winter of 1883, he found himself alone at a coastal lighthouse on the New England shore. This is not a story of heroism or dramatic rescue. It is a story of endurance, the quiet, unremarkable endurance that characterized the lives of so many keepers. William was 42 years old that winter. He had come to Lighthouse keeping later than some, after years working on merchant vessels. The sea was what he knew, and when age and a weakening back made shipboard labor less feasible, the lighthouse service offered a natural transition. The work was still hard, but it was steady, predictable, and for a man who had never been entirely comfortable in crowds, the isolation was not the deterrent it might have been for others. He had been at this particular station for 3 years, long enough to know every stone in the tower's construction, every peculiarity of the clockwork mechanism, every mood of the sea that surrounded his narrow world. The winter of 1883 began early. By late November, Ice was already forming in the harbor, irregular sheets of it that rose and fell with the tide, grinding against the rocks with a sound like distant conversation. The supply boat made its final run on the 28th of November, delivering oil, coal for the small stove, and provisions that would need to last until the ice broke in spring. William watched the boat depart. He raised his hand in farewell to the captain. A gesture returned, and then the boat was a shape in the fog, then a sound growing fainter, then nothing. He was alone, truly alone. The nearest town was visible on clear days, a collection of buildings 4 miles distant across water that was becoming increasingly impassable. He had food enough, fuel enough, oil enough. He had his duties. He had time. So much time. The routine sustained him, as it was designed to do. Each morning, the same sequence. Wake, dress, climb, extinguish, clean, descend, record. Each day, the same maintenance tasks, the endless small labors that filled the hours. Each evening, the same preparation, the same lighting, the same cranking of the weight that would fall through the night, turning the lens with mechanical patience. The weather grew colder. Snow fell, light at first, then heavier. It accumulated on the rocks, on the railings, on the narrow walkway that circled the tower's exterior. William shoveled it away, not because it posed any immediate danger, but because the routine demanded it. Because having tasks, however unnecessary, was better than having none. The storms came, as they always did. Winter storms in New England are not subtle affairs. They arrive with winds that make the tower sway perceptibly, with waves that reach heights difficult to credit until you've seen them yourself. William weathered these storms as he weathered everything, by attending to his duties with methodical care. During the worst of them, he remained in the lantern room throughout the night, cranking the clockwork every 30 minutes, watching the light, wiping salt spray from the windows with a cloth that never quite dried. The tower groaned around him. The wind screamed. The waves struck with percussive force. And the light turned and turned and turned. January arrived. The ice in the harbor was thick enough now that William could see it clearly, even in fog a white expanse broken by dark channels of open water. No boats ventured out. The lighthouse stood isolated, a vertical element in a horizontal world of gray water and white ice and grayer sky. William's logbook entries from this period are remarkably consistent. Wind NNE strong, seas rough, visibility poor. Light exhibited as usual. Day after day, the entries vary only in small details. The direction of the wind, the precise degree of visibility, the time of a passing ship, rare in winter, its lights visible in the distance, a reminder that the world continued elsewhere. He read during the long hours between duties. He had brought books with him, practical volumes mostly, a manual on lighthouse maintenance, a guide to weather prediction, a Bible, though he was not particularly religious. He read them slowly, absorbing every word, because when he finished, he would simply begin again. There were no new books until spring. He wrote letters, though he couldn't send them. He addressed them to his sister in Boston, to former shipmates, to acquaintances whose faces were growing dim in memory. He wrote about the weather, about the light, about small observations, a seal he'd seen sunning itself on a rock, a peculiar formation of ice, the way sunset colored the snow on particularly clear evenings. He folded these letters carefully and placed them in a box where they would remain until the supply boat returned. What the logbook doesn't record, what William's unsent letters barely acknowledge, is the quality of the silence. In winter, with ice dampening the waves, with snow muffling what little sound reaches the lighthouse, the quiet becomes almost tangible. The clockwork mechanism's ticking grows louder in this silence. The creak of floorboards under your feet seems startlingly loud. Your own breathing becomes audible. The sound of turning a page echoes in the small keeper's quarters. William found himself talking aloud sometimes, just to hear a human voice. He would narrate his tasks as he performed them. Now I'll fill the oil reservoir. Careful not to spill. Good. Now the wick needs trimming just a bit. There. The sound of his own voice was both comforting and unsettling. It reminded him that he was still here, still real. But it also emphasized his solitude in a way that silence somehow did not. At night, lying in his narrow bed, he could hear the tower settling small creaks and groans as the stone responded to changes in temperature. He could hear wind finding its way through gaps he'd never located despite searching. He could hear the distant, muffled boom of waves, softened by ice, but never entirely absent. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, he could hear nothing at all. A silence so complete, it seemed to have weight, to press against him. In those moments, he would rise, light a candle, and climb to the lantern room just to confirm the light was still burning, the lens still turning. Not because he doubted his work, but because he needed the reassurance of the light's steady presence, its gentle rotation, its patient performance of its duty. Humans adapt. It's perhaps our most fundamental characteristic. William adapted to his isolation by developing rituals beyond those required by duty. He took his meals at precisely the same times each day, setting a place at the small table as if dining with company. He laid out a cloth, positioned his plate and cup with care, sat upright, ate slowly. It would have been easier to eat standing at the stove, to shovel food in quickly and return to other tasks. But the ritual mattered. It imposed structure on time that otherwise threatened to become formless. He maintained his appearance, shaving every 3 days, trimming his beard, washing though the water was frigid and the process uncomfortable. Again, it would have been easier to let such things slide. No one was watching. No one would know. But he would know. And maintaining these small disciplines helped maintain the sense of himself as a civilized man, not a hermit succumbing to wildness. He talked to the light as if it were a companion. "Good evening," he would say as he lit the lamp. "Time for another night's work, isn't it?" And in the morning, extinguishing it. "Well done. Rest now." The light, of course, never answered. But the ritual of greeting and farewell added a social dimension, however imagined, to tasks that were otherwise entirely solitary. February brought the winter's worst weather. A series of storms, each more violent than the last, battered the lighthouse with winds that William estimated based on years of experience at 70 or 80 miles per hour. During these storms, sleep became impossible. He remained in the lantern room, cranking the clockwork, tending the lamp, watching through windows that flexed visibly under the wind's assault. Ice formed on the exterior of the glass, reducing visibility to nothing. He couldn't see the light's beam, couldn't see whether it was reaching outward as it should. He could only trust. Trust in the lens, in the lamp, in the mechanism. Trust in his own work. On the third night of the worst storm, something in the mechanism began to grind. A sound that shouldn't be there, metal on metal in a way that spoke of misalignment. William's heart quickened, the first strong emotion he'd felt in weeks. If the mechanism failed, the light would stop rotating. It would become a steady light, not the flashing pattern ships expected. Worse, it might fail entirely. He stopped the mechanism. In the sudden stillness relative to the mechanism, the storm still raged. He examined the gears by lamplight. His hands were steady despite the cold, despite the fear. Years of working with machinery served him well. He found the problem. A gear had shifted slightly on its shaft, causing it to catch against its neighbor. The repair required tools from the base of the tower. It required precision work in freezing temperatures, with hands that were losing feeling. It required patience and focus and the absolute determination to get it right, because there was no one else, no one to call for help, no alternative. It took him 4 hours. 4 hours of careful adjustment, of testing, of readjustment. His fingers were numb. His back ached from bending over the mechanism. The storm screamed around him, indifferent to his struggle. But finally, the mechanism ran smoothly again. He released the brake. The lens began to turn. The light flashed out into the storm, and William allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, quiet, internal, but real. March brought the first hints that winter's grip was weakening. The ice in the harbor began to break up, driven by storms and tied into ever smaller pieces. Water appeared between the floes, dark and somehow alive after the static white of frozen sea. William found himself watching for birds. They would be among the first signs of spring seabirds returning to nesting sites, migrating species passing through. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed seeing birds until the first gull appeared, riding the wind with casual mastery. The supply boat arrived on March 23rd. William saw it while making his morning rounds, a dark shape moving carefully between ice floes. He felt, what? Relief, certainly. Gratitude. But also something unexpected. A faint reluctance. He had adapted so thoroughly to solitude that the prospect of conversation, of other voices, of questions in small talk, felt almost invasive. Still, he went down to the landing to meet the boat. The captain stepped out, grinning. "Harper, good to see you made it through. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," William said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, rusty from disuse, despite his habit of talking to himself. "Light's been exhibited every night without fail." "Good man," the captain said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's get you resupplied." William Harper served at that lighthouse for another 7 years, through 7 more winters, though none quite as isolated as that first one. He retired in 1890, relocating to a small cottage within sight of the sea, but no longer responsible for tending its lights. In his retirement, people sometimes asked him about the isolation. Wasn't it terrifying? Wasn't it lonely beyond bearing? William would consider the questions carefully before answering. "You adapt," he would say. "Humans are good at adapting. You find rhythms. You develop routines. The work keeps you grounded." What he didn't say, what he perhaps couldn't quite articulate, was that the isolation had also given him something. In the forced simplicity of that winter, in the reduction of life to its essential elements, light, darkness, work, rest, he had found a kind of clarity, a understanding of what mattered and what didn't, a peace that came from knowing precisely what was required of him and being able to fulfill those requirements. It wasn't a peace everyone would want, but it was real, and in its own quiet way, it was profound. Before we turn to mysteries, let us consider what lighthouses represented to the communities that built them. In the 1880s, a lighthouse was more than a navigational aid. It was a statement of human determination, a declaration that even the wildest coastlines could be marked, measured, made safer. Each lighthouse spoke in its own particular language. Not words, but patterns of light. A flash every 30 seconds. 2 flashes in quick succession followed by darkness. A steady light interrupted by brief eclipses. These patterns were as distinctive as signatures, recorded in maritime guides that sailors studied with the dedication of scholars. The technology that made this possible was itself a kind of marvel. The Fresnel lens, invented by French physicist Augustin-Jean Fresnel in 1822, represented a revolutionary understanding of how light behaves. Rather than using a single thick piece of glass, which absorbed and scattered light, giving it a muddy appearance, Fresnel designed a lens made of hundreds of precisely cut prisms arranged in concentric rings. The principle was elegant. Light that would normally scatter in all directions was captured and bent, refracted into a single intense beam. The largest of these lenses, called first-order lenses, stood over 12 feet tall and weighed several tons. They were assembled like 3-dimensional puzzles, each piece of glass ground and polished to exacting specifications, then fitted into brass frameworks with tolerance measured in fractions of inches. To stand inside a lit Fresnel lens was to exist within captured light. The prisms fractured and multiplied the lamp's flame into 1,000 points of brilliance. As the lens rotated, these points swept around the horizon, creating the flashing pattern that could be seen 20 miles out to sea on clear nights. It was beautiful. Practical, certainly, but also beautiful in the way that perfectly executed engineering often is. Lighthouse keepers in the 1880s formed a distinct subculture within maritime communities. They were set apart by their work's nature solitary, responsible, requiring both technical skill and uncommon patience. Many keepers came from seafaring backgrounds. They understood weather, tides, the moods of the ocean. They could read clouds and predict storms with accuracy that rivaled formal meteorology. This knowledge was essential, but it wasn't sufficient. A good keeper also needed mechanical aptitude, the ability to maintain complex equipment with limited resources and no immediate assistance. Perhaps most importantly, a keeper needed psychological resilience, the ability to endure isolation without succumbing to what the service delicately termed mental strain. Not everyone possessed this quality. The turnover rate among lighthouse keepers was higher than official records often acknowledged. Some lasted a single winter before requesting transfer to less isolated stations. Others lasted decades, finding in the solitude something that suited their temperament. Women served as lighthouse keepers more often than popular history remembers. When a male keeper died or became incapacitated, his wife or daughter often assumed his duties, sometimes for years. They performed the same tasks, kept the same watches, endured the same isolation. The lighthouse service, pragmatic if not progressive, generally accepted this arrangement. A light tended by a keeper's widow was better than a dark light waiting for a replacement. These women keepers left fewer records than their male counterparts. Their letters and logbooks, when they survived, revealed the same dedication to duty, the same careful attention to detail, the same quiet endurance. Yet despite this dedication, despite the careful routines and the reliable technology, lighthouses remained places where the ordinary could suddenly give way to the inexplicable. The sea is vast, and human understanding is limited. In that gap between what we know and what we cannot explain, mysteries find room to exist. Consider the nature of these places. Lighthouses were built at the margins, on rocky islands, on storm-battered headlands, on narrow strips of sand extending into open ocean. They marked the boundary between the known world of land and the unknown depths of water. They were inhabited, but barely. Civilized, but only just. In such places, under conditions of extreme isolation, the human mind sometimes perceived things that defied easy explanation. Sounds that seemed to have no source. Lights where no lights should be. The sensation of presence when one was supposedly alone. The lighthouse service, in its official capacity, had no patience for such reports. Keepers who spoke too openly of unusual experiences risked their reputations. The logbooks were for facts, wind speed, visibility, the comings and goings of ships, not for shadows glimpsed from the corner of one's eye, or voices heard in the wind that seemed to speak one's name. So keepers learned to keep certain observations to themselves, to dismiss what they couldn't explain, to focus on the work, on the measurable, on the routine that grounded them in reality. But the stories persisted, passed quietly between keepers during rare meetings, shared in letters, whispered in the taverns of coastal towns. Some mysteries, however, could not be dismissed or quietly filed away. Some demanded attention, generated questions that lingered long after the events themselves had passed into history. In December of 1900, just as the century was turning, 3 lighthouse keepers vanished from a remote Scottish island called Eilean Mor, one of the Flannan Isles. The lighthouse that was new, built only the previous year, a modern structure with all the latest equipment. The keepers were experienced men. James Duckett, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, with 20 years of service, and William MacArthur, known for his competence and steady temperament. On the night of December 15th, 1900, a passing steamer noted that the Flannan Light was dark. This was unusual enough to be reported, But immediate investigation was impossible. The Flannan Isles were remote, accessible only in favorable weather. The report was filed, and days passed. On December 26th, Boxing Day, a relief vessel arrived at the island. The captain sounded the ship's horn. No response. He fired a flare into the sky. Silence. A boat was launched, and men rowed to the landing. They climbed the stone steps carved into the cliff face, made their way to the lighthouse. The door was closed, but unlocked. Inside, everything was in order. The lamps had been cleaned and trimmed. The oil reservoirs were full. The wicks were ready for lighting. The beds were made. Dishes had been washed and put away. The kitchen clock had stopped, but there were no keepers. Not in the lighthouse, not in the outbuildings, not anywhere on the small island. The search party examined everything with growing unease. In the entrance hall, 2 of the 3 sets of oilskins hung on their pegs. The third set was missing. This suggested that one keeper had gone outside, perhaps to check on something. But why would the other 2 have left as well? And without their protective gear? The logbook offered fragmentary clues, but they raised more questions than they answered. Entries from December 12th, written by Marshall, described a storm of extraordinary violence winds, stronger than anything he'd encountered in 2 decades at sea. He noted that Duckett, normally talkative, had been strangely quiet, and MacArthur, known for his toughness, had been seen crying. But here was the puzzling part. Weather records from nearby islands and the mainland showed no evidence of such a storm. December 12th had been unremarkable. The violent weather Marshall described in the log simply hadn't occurred, not according to any other observer. The final entry was dated December 13th. Nothing was recorded for the 14th or 15th. The slate used for temporary notes was blank. The 3 keepers had simply stopped, and then they had vanished. In the aftermath, theories proliferated. Perhaps a rogue wave had swept all 3 men into the sea. But experienced keepers knew better than to stand together in a dangerous location during storms. Perhaps there had been an accident, 1 man injured, the others attempting rescue, all meeting disaster. But what accident would require all 3 to respond? More exotic explanations circulated in whispers. Sea monsters, ghosts, abduction by forces unknown. These were dismissed by official investigations, but they persisted in the public imagination, fed by the unsettling completeness of the mystery. The official verdict was swept away by a wave, but even those who wrote the report seemed unsure. How could a wave reach high enough to take men from a lighthouse built well above normal sea level? Why would experienced keepers position themselves to be vulnerable to such a wave? And how to explain Marshall's log entries about a storm that apparently never happened? The lighthouse was restaffed. New keepers took up residence, tended the light, maintained the equipment. The Flannan Light continued its work, flashing its pattern across the North Atlantic for decades more. But the 3 keepers who vanished on or around December 15th, 1900, were never found. No bodies, no wreckage, no evidence except absence. What makes certain mysteries compelling is not their sensational nature, but their resistance to resolution. The Flannan Isles disappearance fits this pattern. It's not that nothing is known. The physical evidence was carefully documented. Theories were proposed and examined. Rather, it's that what is known doesn't quite add up to a complete picture. There are gaps, inconsistencies, details that refuse to align into a coherent narrative. This incompleteness has a peculiar quality. It invites speculation while resisting certainty. It reminds us that despite our technologies, despite our careful records and systematic investigations, some events remain stubbornly opaque. For lighthouse keepers who learned of the Flannan disappearance, and most did, through the informal networks that connected isolated stations, the story carried a particular resonance. It confirmed something they perhaps already suspected, that their work placed them in proximity to forces not entirely understood, that the sea, for all humanity's attempts to measure and predict it, retained mysteries. That isolation and the natural world's power created conditions where the normal rules seemed somehow less firm. Lighthouses entered the cultural imagination as symbols of both safety and isolation. They appeared in paintings, often depicted at sunset or in storms, moments of transition, of drama softened by distance. They featured in poems that used them as metaphors for steadfastness, for lonely duty, for light persisting against darkness. But there was always an undertone of unease in these cultural representations. The lighthouse as a place apart. The keeper as a figure isolated from normal human community, dwelling in the margin between land and sea, between civilization and wilderness. A necessary figure, performing necessary work, but separate. Other. This otherness was both attractive and troubling. Some romanticized it, the noble keeper, solitary guardian of the coast. Others found it vaguely unsettling, a man alone in his tower. What might such isolation do to a person's mind? The reality, as is often the case, was more complex than either romanticization or fear suggested. Lighthouse keepers were workers, performing skilled labor under difficult conditions. Some thrived in the role. Others found it challenging but manageable. A few discovered too late that they were temperamentally unsuited to such isolation. And occasionally, very occasionally, something happened that defied explanation. A disappearance. An inexplicable observation. A story that wouldn't quite settle into comfortable rationality. Many of the lighthouses built in the 1880s still stand. The technology has changed automated lights, solar panels, radio beacons, but the towers themselves remain, testament to the quality of their construction. Some are museums now, open to visitors who climb the spiral stairs and emerge into lantern rooms where the original Fresnel lenses still sit, no longer lit but still beautiful in their geometric precision. Walking through these preserved lighthouses, one can still sense something of what the keepers experienced. The isolation is harder to access. Modern visitors arrive in groups, stay briefly, leave. But the physical environment remains. The narrow confines, the endless stairs, the way sound echoes, the quality of light filtering through glass. The logbooks, too, survive in archives. Pages and pages of careful handwriting, recording weather conditions and routine maintenance, forming an indirect record of lives lived in extreme solitude. The entries are repetitive, factual, occasionally monotonous. But read closely, they reveal rhythms, patterns, small variations that hint at the human beings behind the words. And very occasionally, there are gaps. Days without entries, inconsistencies, moments where the record falls silent, and we are left to wonder what happened, what was experienced but not recorded, what stories ended without resolution. The sea keeps its secrets, the lighthouses stand, and the mysteries, like the light itself, continue to turn through darkness, offering illumination that somehow emphasizes the vast unknown that surrounds it. While the lighthouse keeper lived his measured, solitary existence, the world he served continued in patterns quite different from his own. Let us step back from the tower, back across the water, to the coastal communities that grew and changed through the 1880s, aware of the lights that marked their shores, but rarely thinking about the men who tended them. The Victorian seaside town was undergoing transformation during this decade. What had been small fishing villages were becoming fashionable resorts, their economies shifting from the extraction of the sea's resources to the provision of leisure for urban visitors seeking the supposed health benefits of salt air and cold water bathing. Weston-super-Mare, for instance, built seawalls and promenades during the 1880s. Gaslighting illuminated its streets. Sewage systems, designed by celebrated engineers, carried waste away from the growing population. Hotels rose along the waterfront, their architecture deliberately grand, speaking of prosperity and modernity. Schools opened, churches were built. The town grew not organically, but through deliberate planning and investment. This was a world of proximity, of social density that would have been almost overwhelming to someone accustomed to lighthouse isolation. The streets filled with people, residents and visitors, merchants and servants, children and elderly, all moving through shared spaces with the casual intimacy of the unisolated. Within these coastal towns, a specific subset of the population maintained more direct connection to the sea. The mariners and those whose livelihoods depended on shipping formed what historians recognize as distinct communities within the larger towns. The physical layout of these communities revealed their priorities. Warehouses dominated the waterfront. Chandler's shops sold rope, canvas, tar, the material necessities of seafaring. Taverns catered specifically to sailors, offering not just drink, but informal labor exchanges, where crews were assembled and ships found their complement of workers. These maritime communities had their own rhythms, different from both the isolated lighthouse and the resort town. They followed the schedules of tide and wind, the arrival and departure of ships, the seasonal patterns of trade routes. A ship in port meant work for dock workers, custom for taverns and boarding houses, business for the merchants who dealt in cargo. The mariners themselves occupied a peculiar social position. They were part of these communities, yet also apart from them. Their work took them away for months at a time. They returned changed by experiences foreign to those who remained ashore. They spoke a specialized language, understood hierarchies and dangers that landlubbers could not fully grasp. Within the maritime community, they were central. Within the larger town, they were somewhat marginal. Consider the life of an ordinary sailor in the 1880s, a man whose safety depended on the lighthouse keeper's diligence, though the two would likely never meet. Conditions aboard merchant vessels varied considerably, but were rarely comfortable. Living quarters were cramped, often below the waterline where the motion of the ship was most pronounced. Sailors slept in hammocks or narrow bunks, their personal possessions limited to what would fit in a small chest. Privacy was non-existent. The air below decks was close, heavy with the smell of too many men in too small a space. The work was physically demanding. Sails had to be set and taken in, a task requiring coordination, strength, and the willingness to climb high into the rigging even in foul weather. Decks needed constant maintenance. Cargo had to be loaded and secured, unloaded and tallied. The ship itself required ongoing repair. A vessel at sea was in constant battle against the corrosive effects of salt water and the mechanical stresses of motion. Hierarchy aboard ship was rigid and enforced with sometimes brutal discipline. The captain's authority was absolute. Officers occupied a middle position subordinate to the captain, but elevated above the ordinary sailors. This hierarchy was reflected in everything from sleeping arrangements to food quality. Officers dined on better fare in separate quarters, while sailors ate basic rations in communal spaces. Yet despite the hardships, men continued to choose this life. Some had few other options. The sea offered employment to those with strength of limited education. Others were drawn by the promise of adventure, or at least variety. A sailor might see ports across the world, experience cultures foreign to their origins, accumulate stories, if not wealth. And there was the pay. In the 1880s, an American sailor might earn $100 per month, substantial wages compared to many land-based occupations. British sailors earned less, but still enough to support families during their time ashore, to drink and spend with the temporary freedom of those who knew their next voyage would again limit their liberties. Far removed from both the isolated keeper and the working sailor was the administrative apparatus that managed Britain's lighthouse system. Trinity House, the organization responsible for lighthouses around much of the English and Welsh coasts, operated from headquarters in London. Here, the sea was not an immediate physical presence, but an abstraction represented in charts and reports. The Elder Brethren, the governing body of Trinity House, made decisions about lighthouse construction, keeper appointments, and operational policies from comfortable offices far from salt spray and fog. The transformation of Trinity House during the early 19th century reflected broader Victorian attitudes toward organization and efficiency. Previously, Many lighthouses had been privately operated under licenses from Trinity House, their owners collecting fees from passing ships. This system was profitable for the license holders, but resulted in inconsistent service and sometimes inadequate maintenance. By the 1880s, Trinity House had taken direct control of most lights. This centralization allowed for standardization, uniform procedures, regular inspections, consistent record keeping. The instructions issued to keepers were detailed and specific, covering everything from the timing of lighting and extinguishing to the proper reception of visitors, from oil accounting to the prohibition against unauthorized alterations to lighthouse structures. These administrators worked with good intentions. They genuinely sought to improve maritime safety, to reduce the terrible toll of shipwrecks that plagued Britain's coasts. But their understanding of lighthouse keeping was necessarily theoretical. They knew the procedures, but not the lived experience. They understood isolation as a concept, but not as a daily reality. The keepers' logbooks, when they arrived for inspection, were read for compliance with regulations. Were the lights exhibited on schedule? Was oil consumption within expected parameters? Were any irregularities properly noted and explained? The logs were not read for what they revealed about the keepers' inner lives, their struggles with monotony or loneliness, their small victories and private defeats. Between the sailor and the administrator, between the physical and the bureaucratic, stood the ship's captain. In the 1880s, a captain occupied a position of significant authority and responsibility. His decisions affected not just his own fate, but that of his entire crew and cargo. Navigation in this era was as much art as science. Charts existed, of course, and instruments allowed for the calculation of position using celestial observation. But in fog or storm, when visibility was limited and the sky obscured, a captain relied on experience, on intimate knowledge of particular coastlines, on the interpretation of subtle signs, the color of water, the behavior of birds, the smell of land carried on wind. In such conditions, lighthouses became crucial references. A captain who recognized a particular light's characteristic pattern knew his position, could adjust his course accordingly, could navigate with confidence even when other methods failed. The flashing light glimpsed through fog was more than a warning of hazard. It was confirmation of location, a fixed point in an uncertain world. Yet captains, like the administrators, rarely thought about the individual keepers. The light was what mattered, not the man who tended it. A captain might spend years sailing past a particular lighthouse, depending on its light dozens of times, without ever knowing the keeper's name or circumstances. The relationship was functional, impersonal. The keeper provided a service essential to the captain's work, but the two existed in separate spheres that intersected only through the medium of light itself. Not all keepers were isolated in the manner we've described. Some lighthouses, particularly those on headlands rather than islands, included housing for keepers' families. In these situations, the keeper, wife, and children lived the peculiar existence of being physically removed from community while not experiencing the total solitude of the offshore stations. These women keepers' wives lived lives shaped by their husband's occupation, but distinct from it. They maintained households in isolated locations, often with limited access to markets, schools, or medical care. They raised children in environments where the nearest neighbor might be miles away. They managed during the frequent periods when keepers were on duty and unavailable for domestic concerns. Some of these women became unofficial assistant keepers, learning the procedures, helping with routine maintenance, capable of tending the light if their husbands became ill or injured. The lighthouse service, pragmatic as ever, generally accepted this arrangement. A light tended by a keeper as trained wife was better than a light left dark while a replacement was sought. Yet these women received no official recognition, no salary, no formal acknowledgement of their contributions. They existed in the records only as dependents, footnotes to their husband's employment. Their work was invisible, assumed unpaid. The children of lighthouse keepers grew up in unusual circumstances. Their playground was rock and shore, their companions the seabirds and occasional seals. Education was often informal reading lessons from parents, arithmetic learned through helping with log entries and supplies accounting. Some developed deep attachments to these isolated places, finding in the simplicity and solitude something that suited their temperaments. Others longed for the normal social worlds of children in towns, the friendships and activities that isolation denied them. In the coastal towns themselves, awareness of the lighthouses varied. Everyone knew they were there, of course. Their lights were visible on clear nights, distant but present. But active consideration of them, of the work that went into maintaining them, of the lives of the men who tended them, this was rare. The lighthouse keeper occupied a category somewhere between public servant and hermit. Respected in abstract, the important work they did was acknowledged, but not quite part of the community. They appeared in town during their shore leave, conducting business, purchasing supplies, perhaps visiting a tavern. Then they departed again, back to their towers, leaving barely a ripple in the town's social fabric. For the townspeople, life continued in its ordinary patterns. Markets opened and closed. Children attended school. Churches held services. Courtships progressed to marriages, marriages to families, families through generations. The social density of town life, the constant negotiation of proximity and relationship, created a world as foreign to the isolated keeper as his isolation was foreign to them. The 1880s saw significant disparities in wealth within British maritime communities. Ship owners, successful merchants, those who controlled the means of maritime commerce, these accumulated substantial fortunes. They built grand houses, educated their children at good schools, moved in social circles that included local gentry and eventually might merge with it. At the opposite end, ordinary sailors and dock workers lived more precarious existences. When ships were in port and work available, they earned decent wages. But work was not always available. Weather, seasonal variations in trade, economic downturns all affected employment. A sailor between ships might find himself without income, dependent on savings that were often inadequate, or on the charity of institutions established specifically for the maritime poor. The lighthouse keeper's position fell between these extremes. The pay was modest but regular. Employment with stable keepers who performed adequately could expect to remain in service for decades. There was no prospect of wealth, but neither was there the precarity of the ordinary sailor's life. It was, in many ways, a lower middle-class existence, distinguished more by its isolation than its economic position. Throughout the 1880s, the British coast continued to change. New lighthouses were constructed. Existing ones were upgraded with more powerful lenses, better mechanisms. The number of shipwrecks declined gradually, though they remained tragically common. Maritime trade grew, benefiting from improvements in ship design, navigation, and coastal marking. The lighthouse keepers were part of this progress, though peripherally. They did not design the new lenses or decide where new lights should be built. They simply tended what they were given, maintained what they were assigned, kept the lights burning night after night. Their contribution was essential, but easily overlooked. When a ship successfully navigated a dangerous coast, the credit went to the captain's skill, to the quality of charts, to favorable weather. The keeper who had ensured the guiding light was visible received no acknowledgement. His work was noticed only in its absence, when a light failed and ships ran aground. This lack of recognition was not malicious, merely natural. The keeper was too far away, too removed from normal social interaction, to become a visible presence in the maritime world's consciousness. He was like the mechanism he tended to assume to work, noticed only when it failed. So we see a paradox. The lighthouse keeper and the maritime world he served existed in fundamentally different realities. The sailor moved constantly, the keeper remained fixed. The town was characterized by social density, the lighthouse by isolation. The administrator worked with abstractions and policies, the keeper with oil and glass and the physical demands of maintenance. Yet these separate worlds were connected through purpose. The keeper's solitary labor enabled the sailor's voyage. The administrator's decisions shaped the keeper's working conditions. The town's prosperity depended on maritime trade, which depended on safe navigation, which depended on the lights burning steadily in their isolated towers. None could function without the others, yet the connections between them were thin, almost invisible. The lighthouse keeper performed his duty in isolation, serving people he would never know, enabling activities he would never directly witness, part of a system that barely acknowledged his individual existence. There was something both noble and melancholy in this arrangement. Noble in the selflessness it required work done without recognition, service provided without thanks. Melancholy in the profound separation it enforced, the way it positioned one man alone in a tower while life continued elsewhere in patterns he could observe but not fully participate in. As darkness falls on our exploration of this world, as we prepare to return to our own time and circumstances, this contrast remains striking. The keeper in his tower, the sailor on his ship, the administrator at his desk, the townspeople, in their daily routines, all connected by light, by duty, by the necessities of maritime commerce, yet separated, by distance, by experience, by the particular demands of their different lives. The light continues to turn. The lens continues to flash. And somewhere, in the comfortable distance between acknowledgement and forgetting, the lighthouse keeper continues his watch, tending the flame that guides others home while he remains always apart. And so we return gently from that isolated tower, from that world of measured routine and profound solitude. The lighthouse keeper's watch is ending. Dawn is approaching. The light that has turned through another night will soon be extinguished, the lens covered, the tower settling into its daytime quiet. We have traveled together through the rhythms of keeping, the climbs and descents, the cleaning and winding, the watching and waiting. We have met William Harper and his winter of isolation. We have contemplated mysteries that resist resolution. We have seen the keeper as world in contrast to the broader maritime society he served, but was separate from. What remains, as we let these images fade, is perhaps a deeper appreciation for work done in isolation, for duty performed without audience, for the quiet persistence required to maintain something essential while the world moves on, largely unaware. The lighthouse keepers are mostly gone now. Automation has replaced their steady hands, their patient attention. The towers still stand, the lights still shine, but the keepers' quarters are empty or converted to museums. The logbooks have ended, their final entries noting the transition to automatic operation, marking the conclusion of a particular way of working and living. Yet something of their experience persists. In our own lives, we all sometimes tend lights in isolated towers. We all perform necessary work that others may not notice or acknowledge. We all navigate between the social and the solitary, between duty and desire, between the rhythms imposed by responsibility and the freedoms we imagine but cannot quite reach. The lighthouse keeper's life, for all its peculiarity, speaks to something universal. The search for meaning in routine, the challenge of endurance, the strange peace that can emerge from limitation when the possibilities narrow to a manageable few and the demands become clear. Tonight, if you find yourself wakeful, imagine that you can hear the distant tick of a clockwork mechanism, the gentle rotation of glass and light. Imagine the comfort of absolute clarity about what is required: light the lamp, tend the flame, keep the watch. Imagine the simplicity of a world reduced to essential elements. And then let that imagining fade as you settle more deeply into rest. Let the rhythms of the keeper's work, so steady, so measured, so soothingly predictable, carry you toward sleep. The light is tended, the watch is kept, all is well. The tower stands, the sea continues, and you, safe in the present, warmed and sheltered, may rest. The lights that guide us burn steadily, tended by no one now, but burning nonetheless, their beams sweeping across dark water, marking boundaries, showing the way. Sleep well. The watch continues. Morning will come, and when it does, the light will have done its work, as it always has, as it always will. Rest now.